Hi, this is the Espresso podcast, and we are very excited to get started with our first episode. This is a very special episode, not only because it's the kickoff, but also because we are joined by the brilliant Peter Coy, who is a New York Times economics opinion writer who has also written for Business Week and Bloomberg. We're also here with junior economist writers Christopher Wing and Lucian Kirby. I'm Sarah, the chief editor for the Junior Economist, and I will be your main host for today. So without further ado, let's get started.
Peter, welcome to the JEC podcast. We are very excited to have you with us today. And before we talk about your recent New York Times article on economics for the imaginative lens of science fiction, can you first tell us how you got interested in economics and how your education and career has led you to what you do today?
Sure. Well, first of all, I'm very happy to be on with you and wish your organization and the podcast much luck. So I grew up in Connecticut, and I went to Cornell, and I majored in history. And after college, I worked for my college paper, became the editor-in-chief. And then after college, I decided to become a journalist just because didn't know what else to do with my life. But I was not specializing in economics or business. I worked for paper and news for Waterbury, Connecticut, and then I worked for Associated Press. The first contact really with business was when the Associated Press had me open a new bureau in Rochester, New York, which is the home of Eastman Kodak, and Xerox had big operations there. Also Bausch and Lomb. Corning was in the southern tier, which was within my coverage area. So I started covering more and more business. And then I got invited to move down to the New York City office of Associated Press, the world headquarters, to specially cover trade, technology, and some econ. So loved it. And then Business Week hired me. And I worked at Business Week for many years under McGraw-Hill. And then Business Week was purchased by Bloomberg. So it became Bloomberg Business Week. And had more happy years there. And then I got recruited by the New York Times a little over a year ago to start a new newsletter for the opinion section on economics. They basically hired me to start a newsletter, and I said, well, I think it should probably be about economics because that's what I know a little bit more about than other subjects. So that's it. That's the story. I really have had a great career doing this. I'm not a trained economist, first thing to say, not even an untrained economist. I'm not an economist at all, but I do have the opportunity in my job to interview Nobel laureates on a regular basis, both well-established and up-and-coming economists in all corners of the profession in countries all over the world. And it's just a wonderful opportunity. And I try to let my enthusiasm for the field show through in my writing.
Amazing. So going a little bit earlier, did you do anything in high school, such as internships or clubs that may have sparked your interest or began your experience in either economics or writing?
So in high school, I was very involved in sports. I did cross country, indoor track, and outdoor track, and that kind of like took up all my extracurricular space. So really nothing like that. I didn't even write for my high school newspaper, to tell the truth, one or two articles. And I continued with track on a walk-on junior varsity basis at Cornell, and it became clear that I was never going to make varsity, just not good enough. So I sort of gravitated towards the newspaper, and it was probably a better fit for me. And I really thrived there. I had a great time. And that's what led to my career, really. I took 1 year of econ in college. I had 1 semester micro and 1 semester macro. And I really liked it, but all my friends on the newspaper told me I should major in history. And so I did. And who knows what would have happened if I had stuck with econ.
All right, great. I just wanted to ask, how and why did you go from like majoring at history at Cornell to an economics editor and journalist And just can you tell us a little bit about your overall motivations and career trajectory?
Yeah, so I kind of sketched it out in general, this idea that I was covering business. And then I got involved in things like in 1985, when I was in Rochester for the AP, the US dollar was very, very strong against the Japanese yen and other currencies, the German mark, which doesn't exist anymore, British pound. And I wrote about how the strong dollar was hurting Kodak's exports and making it more vulnerable to cheaper imports, such as like Fuji photofilm from Japan. And I just found this so cool, using these tools of economics to explain what was happening in the real world. And then when I moved to New York, I covered the stock market crash of October 19th, 1987, which, as you may know, was the worst single day decline in the stock market in history. And it's never been remotely matched since then. It was just a completely bolt from the blue, the strangest thing. And so I was shaken by it. I was the lead AP writer on that stock market crash. And that added to my interest in understanding markets, and which of course is related to understanding economics. Then when I was at Business Week, I was not covering econ, I was covering telecommunications and then trade. Well, no, telecom and then technology. And then there was a guy named Michael Mandel, who was covering economics, and he, very bright guy who had a PhD from Harvard in econ and was teaching at NYU, and then left. He didn't really like academic life, so he went into journalism full time. And I realized that I could learn a lot from him. I could sort of get an on-the-job education in, of course, obviously informal way. And so there was an opening in econ on that team, and I applied for it and got it. And so for years, I would learn from Mike as I would work on my articles. And that lasted for the whole time that Business Week was owned by McGraw-Hill. When Bloomberg took over, Mike left. So then I joined the very large econ team under Bloomberg. And now a new transition to the New York Times, where I work with some very smart people. Paul Krugman, of course, is the Nobel laureate economist who's a columnist for the New York Times Opinion. And once in a while, I'll send him an email, bounce an idea off him. What do you think? Although pretty much we're going on separate paths, it's just nice to know that there's somebody of that caliber who I can talk to about stories.
Great. So you talked a little bit about your process that led you to working at the New York Times. What would you say is your favorite thing about your current job?
I have always enjoyed learning new things and then turning around and explaining them to people. I like both halves of that process. If I just learned about it and didn't get to tell people, that would not be satisfying. On the other hand, if I just started jabbering about stuff that I hadn't learned anything new about, that would also be unsatisfying. But putting those two together is just really enjoyable. You know, there's many different kinds of journalists. There's some who are, I guess you would say, feature writers, 2,500, 5,000, 10,000 word pieces that appear in magazines. That was never my strength. I'm also not an investigative journalist where I'll spend months probing some scandal or something. Again, not my strength. I admire the people who do it. My strength has always been explanation.
In the last month alone, you've written a wide variety of articles in the New York Times, from the energy crisis, the concept of startup money for individuals, the nature of work, student loans, retirement, and what particularly intrigued us, which was why economists need to read more sci-fi. Where do you get your ideas for your articles?
Well, thank you. I think it's true that I range widely just because I have a lot of different interests, and I want to share them with readers. I have like a metaphor that I like to use. You know, certain kinds of whales have baleen, where they swim through the ocean and plankton go through their mouths and then get filtered out by the baleen. So whales have to have tens of thousands of gallons of seawater coursing through all the time in order to filter out the tiny little plankton that provide them with nourishment. And I'm a little bit like that in the sense that in doing a lot of reading and a lot of interviewing, just constantly like trying to find new stuff that might be interesting, and 98% of it's not going to make it into print, but there is that little bit which is precious that I'm glad that I was able to filter out from the flow.
In your article, this is the kind of storytelling that economics needs. You talked about the one reason why economists should read more science fiction. Can you tell us how you first got interested in sci-fi?
When I was in high school, I used to read Robert Heinlein and Isaac Asimov and some of the other greats, and just loved it. I love the way it stretches your mind and brings you to other worlds that don't exist, but maybe could exist somehow. It's rarely just about the physics. It tends to be about people. And so that's a little bit like the way economics is too. It's really a people field. It's masquerading as a mathematical field. And so I figure that science fiction writers are really good at pushing the boundaries, and economists can benefit from that.
Yeah, I'll agree with that. You also wrote another article, Forward Guidance, that helps economists tell new stories and imagine new visions of the world. And what new vision of the economy do you see for the US in the next 5 to 10 years?
So I was reading Kirthan's note. Could you just say the last part about the 5 to 10 years? What's the question exactly?
Oh yeah, what's the vision of the economy? Like what vision do you have for the economy?
Yeah, that's a tough question. I want to stress that, as I've already stressed, that I'm not an economist. So you're hearing from somebody who's just an observer like you, looking at the world and trying to dope out what might happen next. So I guess you could argue, I guess one way to answer that question is to say, put it on the scale of pessimistic to optimistic. I'm always trying to fight my pessimistic streak. So I'll try to be optimistic here. Over the last few centuries, we've made enormous progress as a species. Up until the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, living standards did not increase reliably from one generation to the next. They weren't really much higher in the year 1600 than they had been in the time of the Roman Empire. But then once sort of humanity figured out how to harness technology and capitalism came along, living standards rose at an increasingly rapid clip. And during the 20th century, we had the latter half of the 20th century, we had the rise of China and India lifting hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. just an enormous achievement, which we tend to forget. We tend to focus on the negative, but it's been wonderful. The decline in absolute poverty levels, certainly the battle's not over, but things have gone in the right direction. So even a pessimistic view of the future would have more growth projected on a per capita GDP basis, say over the coming whatever period you're giving, 5 to 10 years, than we had for most of human history. Because any progress at all is more than we had for most of human history. So I'd be optimistic in that sense, without it all diminishing the enormous challenges such as climate change.
Okay, so everyone's interested in the recent interest rate hike by the Feds, and you've also written some articles on them. Can you explain in layman terms what the Fed's role in the financial market is?
Okay, the Federal Reserve has two mandates given to it by Congress. One is to keep interest rates low, to keep inflation low. The other is to keep employment high, full employment. So it uses interest rates to try to achieve both of those objectives. So if the economy is running very hot, which means the inflation rate is high and the unemployment rate is very low, the Fed will raise interest rates. This cools off the economy. And if, on the other hand, if there's a recession, if unemployment is very high and inflation is low, it'll do the opposite. It'll try to lower interest rates. It's traditionally its main tool for doing this was the controlling the level of the federal funds rate, which is a rate that banks charge each other on loans of reserves. Banks are required to have a certain amount of reserves at the Fed for transactions and security and so on. So the Fed has changed the way it controls that federal funds rate, but it's still a key metric for the short-term interest rates. Then it also, in the last decade or so, has also tried to reach out and affect longer-term interest rates, which it does by basically buying or selling long-term bonds, either government bonds or mortgage-backed securities.
Great. So now, can you give us an idea of how the U.S. economy has come to such high inflation lately? And what were the factors and precipitators of this?
Okay, first of all, I will admit that I did not predict such high inflation. I was in the camp of thinking that the burst of inflation was transitory. The joking term for that was team transitory, and I guess I was on team transitory, which turned out to be wrong. But there are two main reasons that inflation got so high. One is that the COVID wrecked supply chains, causing shortages of key things. For example, integrated circuits for cars. The supply of food was interrupted. Many different things couldn't be delivered, and there was a supply shortage. Of course, when there's a supply shortage, the price tends to go up. And it's taken longer than expected to fix those supply chains. The other is, remember, we talk about supply and demand. So now we've talked about the supply being too low. Now we're talking about demand being too high. And that was because of the enormous stimulus given in the US and to a lesser degree in other countries to spending. Economists are like generals in the military. They tend to fight the last war. And the last war in the minds of the policymakers was the recession of 2007 to 2009, precipitated by the global financial crisis. It was quite a deep, long-lasting recession. And the lesson learned was we have to do more. We have to work harder to support growth so we don't have a long-lasting recession. Well, they certainly succeeded in that, because the recession we had in the spring of 2020 was the shortest in history. It basically like lasted, I think, about 1 month before the economy started rebounding. It was a deep V. The problem is that they may have accidentally gone too far, put too much money into people's pockets, and they spent it. And because they were spending it at a time when the supply was low, you had a classic case of inflation, too much money chasing too few goods.
For students of economics, economic theory can be abstract, but the news, economics, and politics are very intertwined, like the energy crisis or Brexit in the UK. Do you think studying economics is important, and how do you get students to think about the relationship between economic theory and how policies affect people every day?
I think every student in high school should learn some economics, and they should learn some statistics too, by the way, which is a related field. I don't think everybody needs to be a master of it, but we've been talking here about supply and demand, and those are such core concepts that everybody should get the idea that when demand is high, all else equal, prices will go up. And when supply is low, all else equal, prices will go up. You know, it helps. It's the funny thing about economics is it's a field that can be incredibly complicated, and the people at the leading edge of it are doing heavy duty work that few outside the field understand. But if you grasp a few key ideas, it gets you a long way towards being able to understand some of those policy issues. The problem that with a lot of policy issues is that people's intuitions, if they have no training in economics, can actually be backwards. For example, surveys have shown that a lot of people think that raising interest rates raises inflation. And the reason they think that is like, hey, look, you're paying more for something. You know, you pay more for bread, you pay more for orange juice, you're paying more for money. Isn't that inflation? Economists, by and large, do not think that. Although you could find the president of Turkey feels that way. So yes, studying econ is important, and it will help illuminate a lot of the social policy issues that you all care about.
What's your advice to high schoolers trying to figure out what type of career direction they want to go into, and what can you do to determine what you're passionate about and want to spend the rest of your life doing?
That's a great question. I think you want to learn some key skills that you know are going to be useful, such as having a decent understanding of math and stats, econ, and you want to, same time, you want to have a broad base in the liberal arts, history and philosophy. Those are not as obviously useful in your day-to-day career, but they're valuable in a couple of ways. One is that they enrich your private life, and there's nothing more important than having a rich private life. But also, I think they'll help you. They'll guide you in your thinking, say on the job. Having studied the great thinkers of our civilization, I say our civilization very broadly, meaning world civilization. So just you all folks on this podcast are probably highly motivated, and I think you're probably all going to do fine. It's the people who aren't trying who are going to have trouble. You know, they're just sleepwalking through high school. and they may not go to college. If they do go to college, they may sleepwalk through college, and they're going to have a tough time. So a lot of it is just making the effort, taking life seriously, and whatever interests you, going for it, being serious about it, trying hard. And I give a lot of advice to kids who are applying to college, because I interview high school students. Not really interview, but I talk to them about their applications. And I always tell them, you get out of school what you put into it. If you can kind of skate by without really learning a lot, and it's legal, it's fine, it's your choice, but you're never going to be happy with the result. Whereas if you go for it, if you try to suck every last drop of juice out of the fruit, you're gonna be benefiting much more. And you don't have to go to the fanciest college to do that. You can get a good education at many, many different places that'll stand you in good stead for a long and fruitful career.
Okay. And then lastly, what advice would you give to high schoolers and members of the JEC thinking about a career in economics?
So economics has become a field that requires a lot of math. So you want to have a really strong basis in calculus and stats and so on, and be prepared for some challenging courses. The main reason that people leave econ courses before they complete the PhD is that the math side of it is too much for them. That's just the way it's structured today. There are people who say that that emphasis should be reduced, but that's the world we're living in. So basically, that's what you'll be confronting. So that, I guess, that'd be one piece of advice. But you don't have to major in econ at the college level in order to go for a PhD in econ. And I'll mention, by the way, that that's true in a lot of different fields. You don't have to be pre-law to become a lawyer. You don't have to be pre-med to become a doctor. In fact, these professional schools very often like it when they have a diverse set of students. I don't mean diverse just ethnically. I mean diverse in terms of their interests. It makes it for a more well-rounded profession.
All right, well, those were all of the questions that we had prepared for you. Thank you so much to our writers for asking the questions, and most of all to Peter for joining us today. This was a great conversation, and yeah, thank you.